Hello and welcome to CG Visuals. My name's Zach, and today we'll be having a look at the air category within Trapcode Elements version 1.1. So let's get started with the project. When you open the folder that you've downloaded, you'll have an assets folder, and if we open this up, we can have a look at some of the assets that are included. So we've got some water, we've got the new OBJ library that was added in the geometry folder. And so this is great when you want to change the variety of the rocks that you're rendering. We've also got some sprites that we are using. For example, these rock chunks, which were also generated using Trapcode Elements. So let's go into the project files. As you can see, we've got 4 main categories. Today we'll be having a look at the air category, but we can have a quick overview while we're here. When you click on one of the folders, you'll see that there is a 2014 and a 2018 version. So let's go into the air category, and we'll have an overview, we'll have a look, and we'll try compositing one of these effects into a scene. Once you're in After Effects, we can open one of these projects. So I'm going to open the Air Whirlwind project as a demonstration. And I'm going to leave the render times in so that we can get a realistic idea of how long it takes to preview some of these effects. In this case, we are working with a fairly large fluid simulation, so it does take a little while to preview. Just something to keep in mind when you first open a project. Trapcode Particular will have to pre-cache the fluid simulation into RAM before it can be displayed. But at half res, we can skip through these frames here and have a little look at what's going on. It's best to not jump too far ahead, as the further ahead in the timeline we go, the longer it will take to pre-cache everything. So let's bring in an image here, or a movie file. I'm going to bring in a photo from some stock photography I have. And let's choose an image that we think will work well with our scene. So I spent quite a while going through these, but I found an image here which I think will work nice. So what we do with the air projects is we actually bring our plate background into the footage pre-comp, and then we can just adjust this until it looks right. So now if we go into the export comp, we can see the result we're getting straight off the bat. But since this is a simulation in 3D with a camera, we can do a little bit better than that and actually make some adjustments. So I'm going to go into the particles comp here. Again, it will take a few seconds to render that. So if we copy and paste our background image into the particles comp just temporarily, we can line that up with the grid and actually get a little preview of how our simulation is going to look in the scene. We will want to disable that before we go back into the export comp, but for now I'm just using the camera controls. I can solo the grid there, just try and line up the floor plane. And once we think that is looking okay, let's just have another look at how it's sitting in the scene. Just observing the light direction. We also have this proxy simulation, which is a dumbed down version of the main sim, and it's a lot faster to work with. So in this case, I think we're not doing anything too difficult, so we can just stick with the main sim at half res. And I think it needs to come down just a little bit more. So I'll pull that down again. Okay, so we'll disable the image that we were using as a reference, hop back into the export comp and wait for those changes to be updated. So now the asset looks like it's actually sitting in the scene a bit better. You'll also notice we have this shadow layer here, and I think the shadow is facing the wrong direction. So it's a 2D shadow which we're achieving by using a power pin here. So there are more complicated ways to do shadows. You could pre-render this and do sorts of stuff, but just for the time being it's a fairly decent result straight off the bat, and it also inherits the color of the ground a little bit more, so it's not just a black shadow. It looks a bit more realistic, so we'll just line this up. And it's quite easy just to make these adjustments. Obviously we can see that the light is coming from screen right, so and let's just toggle that shadow. And I think it's looking a little bit sharp. It's kind of difficult to tell because we're in half res. So what I think I'll do is we'll put the shadow, we'll keep it at 100, and then I think we'll solo the shadow and we'll switch to full res. And in order to generate this shadow, After Effects is actually going to have to calculate the sim at full res for this frame. And full res is a bit slower than half res, so this will take a little bit longer than what we're used to. Okay, so it's a fairly convincing shadow, but I think we'll just put the diffusion up to... See, I tried to put in 300 there, but it limited me to 200, so when the sliders are highlighted red, that means there are some limits, so you can't go too extreme. You'll always be confined to values that will produce fairly acceptable results. So now that I'm happy with the shadow, it's time to start actually playing around with these compositing options. So we can start off with the tint effect here. I kind of like the color, the redness that we've already got, so I'm going to leave the tint quite low, and instead I'm going to select these highlights here. I think we'll sample the sky to try and convey that the light is absorbing some of that light, and really separate the highlights from the midtones there. I think we'll go to the midtones and we'll choose this sand color, and we'll see what that looks like. A little bit on the light side, so let's make a few more adjustments here. Since we're just doing color correction, this will be quite quick and easy to see the changes. And we've also got the shadows as well. So I think we're losing a bit of contrast there. Let's pull down those shadows a bit more until we get something that looks a bit better. Always good to keep experimenting with the values until you're satisfied with the result. We've also got this color overlay here, so this is why we put our plate in a pre-comp. So this is like auto compositing. We can just adjust this slider and it will inherit the colors and luminosity and incorporate that into the smoke sim that we've got. It's more of a dust sim. I've also just unhidden the layers here, and you can see there's a few more layers that aren't initially visible, just so I can now have access to those sharpening controls. And once we're happy with that, I think we'll just solo this dust layer. So this is the separate element that produces the spinning dust near the camera. So if we see how long it takes to preview this just for a few frames. And let's just adjust our render region here so we can get a nice loop going. My initial impression is that I think the dust looks too narrow. I think it needs to be a bit wider and less pronounced. So if we go into these camera dust options here, obviously we can adjust this radius. That will give us a more if the dust was closer to the camera, I think there'd be less detail, so we can adjust that. I think we can play with the dust angle. If we had a shot that was tilting up or tilting down, we could convey that, but I think we will just adjust the opacity as well. So we'll so that's what it looks like at full opacity, so it's a little bit much, but it'll make it easier for us to see what we're doing with this angle here. So this is a fairly level shot, so I think we're going to settle on a value that's a bit closer to 0. And if we just leave it at that, I think that'll work. Okay, so we don't need the dust opacity to be quite that strong. For convenience, most of these effects are all controlled via this compositing options box here, so I think at the height of its intensity it will be semi-transparent. And let's just hop back to the original sort of frame that we were looking at. We'll re-enable these layers here. In some of the other projects it does get a bit more complicated. We can have quite a few layers, but generally if they're highlighted red, then they're a simulation. Grey is something you can usually ignore. Green is for user controls. And we do have these notes and tips in all of the projects. For example, place footage inside this pre-comp. So it's fairly self-explanatory along the way. I put some work into trying to make the user interface look nice and clean. So we give this a pre-render now. We'll see what we've managed to come up with. Let it cache a few frames here so we can see what kind of speed we can expect at half res. And we'll render this at full res as well, and that will take a bit longer, but we don't need to do that until we're happy with the final shot. And since this is going to take a few minutes, I think I'll skip ahead in a moment to when it has finished pre-rendering. And so it's not a bad result. We have a nice whirlwind there. It's interacting with the scene. And so you can quite quickly use these compositing options to get a nice solid fluid simulation working in your shot. And let's have a look at the render time. So we rendered that at full res here, and it took just under an hour, so the render times are to be expected with a fluid sim. So let's have a look at another project. Let's go into the air manipulation. So this is kind of like your go-to project if you have someone waving their hands around or a staff and you want air to follow a certain path. This is like your basic manipulation project. And this exercise will get a little bit more in depth into actually customizing, so we'll have a quick look at this again. You never want to just jump ahead in the timeline too far, because you might give After Effects a bit more than it can handle. Every time I'm jumping ahead here, there are more particles accumulating, and so it's taking longer each time. But if we just jump ahead in little increments like this, we can start to preview what's going on, and we'll give After Effects enough time to keep up with the caching. So this is why it's also useful to have plenty of RAM and also plenty of hard drive space, because when we get into more heavy sims, a lot of that data gets stored in the After Effects cache file, so actually gets stored on your hard drive. So again, we'll go through here, and in the end I decided to go with these stairs. I initially thought, let's have some kind of wind effect coming down the stairs. So kind of making this up on the fly. So again, we'll bring our background in here, adjust it if necessary. Let's copy that by Control C and Control V, paste that into the particles comp. And let's see now, we'll have a look at the emitter, I think. We'll have a look at what's going on here, just to get our bearings. Again, we'll try the proxy simulation. It's a bit difficult to see, so I'm going to... we'll skip ahead, we'll see how fast this renders. Basically, this is the main simulation, but with 10 times less particles and no motion blur or any of the other effects, so it's a lot faster. Just going to come into this curves adjustment and boost the alpha so that it's more easy to see on this video. Okay, so we could use that. Although what I've found is when I'm planning out the motion, I like to make lots of adjustments to the movement, and I want something even faster. So what I find to be helpful is just to create a red solid, and we'll just use this elliptical mask to create a circle. We can enable that as a 3D layer. There are lights in this scene, which is why it goes darker, so we'll just disable the accept lights. And then we will press P, bring up the position, and pick whip that to the emitter locator. And now we can really see what exactly is happening. We can see there's also this spotlight which follows it around, so the simulation will always sort of stay illuminated from a certain direction. So let's start planning out the motion. This is normally the stage where you want to spend the most time really refining this. We want to be able to preview those changes instantly without having to wait for anything to render. So I'm going to push this back. I want a kind of a wind to sort of come down the stairs, blast past the camera. Don't know why, I just thought that would be cool. So if we press Shift, left click and drag, we can get this coming out. I want to create the whole movement, the whole animation with as few keyframes as possible. I'll just drag these handles out here. We should be able to get quite an organic movement. Now, of course, we could like right click on these keyframes and start changing the interpolation and have it accelerate or decelerate, but I think for this we just want a continuous motion. And to make it more interesting, I'm going to add a wiggle expression. since the fluid sim is generated from velocity. So if we have this thing waving about, taking a more turbulent path, it'll hopefully generate a more interesting looking result. So I think we'll put this up to 500. Again, we want to be making these iterations as quickly as possible, so I've sped this section up a little bit because I spent a bit too long experimenting with how I wanted this to come down, so I started changing, experimenting with different motions. Decided this needed to come down a bit more. And eventually I got a motion which I thought looked interesting, so then I disabled the ball, and now we can start actually previewing this. So as you can see, the particles are going to be generated automatically from speed, but we can also multiply those results. If it's moving too quickly, we can turn down the velocity from motion. And as you can see, there's a note here that says set RAM preview speed to 50 FPS, and the composition settings are at 50. This is because at 25 frames per second, some very rapid movements would sometimes cause the fluid simulation to break. Having more frames allows Trapcode Particular to interpolate that movement better, and it normally results in a more consistent look. So let's have a quick look at how this is going. We'll turn off the motion blur just temporarily. That'll speed things up quite a bit. Most of the render time is motion blur, to be honest, as it's adding subframe sampling to all of these particles to generate the motion blur. And so even if you are just doing a title sequence, motion blur will add a lot to the render time. So since the simulation is going off to the right a bit there, we'll just make one last adjustment with the camera. Adjustments like the camera, things like that will happen quite quickly. If you try to completely regenerate the fluid simulation, then it will take longer, but we can move this light around the scene as well. Even though the light is coming off to the right, I think if we position it in a way that communicates like bounce lighting, even though it's not technically correct, it might actually look a bit more realistic. Of course, every shot is different, the lighting is always different, so that's why we have these tools here. And if we turn off our background, I think we can start going into the export comp and doing our compositing adjustments. Make sure to re-enable the motion blur. And as we can see here, we're going to have a few seconds longer while it recalculates things with the motion blur. As you can see, there are options for the samples. In extreme cases, you might want to put the samples up to 8. But we've tried to optimize this off the bat so you get the best result for the minimum amount of processing power. And there we go, there's the motion blur. Go back into the export comp. There are a few post-processing effects going on here that add to the render time as well. So that's why it's best to do all of your animating in the particles comp, and then when we go to the export comp, we have quite a few things happening behind the scene to make the fluid simulation look as smooth as possible. The ultimate goal is we don't want it to look like a fluid simulation. We want it to look like some kind of wind or air. We want it to look more realistic. And so, like we did before, we can go into our compositing options, and yeah, I think we'll start with the midtones. We've got some quite orangey colours going on in this scene. Until you experiment with, all of the different looks, you probably won't be able to decide what looks best. So sometimes it's best to go from one extreme to the other and then bring it back to the middle. Try sampling the sky. It worked last time, but this time I think we need to sample the highlights on the rocks. And it's looking a bit over the top. Key thing is to try and get the contrast and the colours matching. Can be quite difficult to choose the right colours sometimes, so it does require a bit of experimenting and having a general knowledge of compositing. So we've got this option here where we're adding more dust. So I think we'll just tone that down a bit. Doesn't really help. We've got our colour overlay here, which is probably give you the most bang for your buck, as we can slide this back and forth and choose something that works. In this case, 100%. We'll put our shadow opacity up to 100 and we'll have a quick look at what that is doing. It's just one of those things that you might not pay attention to, but subconsciously it'll help improve the realism. Even though technically I think these shadows are probably not accurate, but having some shading on those stairs there makes a bit of a difference. So after looking at this, it does look like dust. It looks a little bit opaque, and I'm not too sure about the shadows. So whilst remaining in the export comp, I can click the lock layers button that you just saw me click. It looks like a little padlock, and then we can actually make adjustments to the particles comp and see those changes reflected in our scene. So I'm going to increase this shadowlet size to 50. I have no idea how it's going to look, but I mean, this is the beauty of just being able to experiment, have the whole thing completely procedural at the compositing stage, because who knows how many tweaks you want to make. We could even go back and randomize the fluid sim itself, experiment with several different looks. If we wanted to go more detailed, we could pre-render it and add additional dust coming off of the stairs or the wall. And there's so much we could do, and we can afford to make that time investment because this process is really quick. So I just press T on the particles pre-comp here, just to bring down the opacity a bit. After changing the opacity, I'll also want to experiment with the color overlay as well. In some scenarios the dust opacity works, but I want quite a translucent effect here. So this is what the workflow will be like. It'll, you know that the simulation is going to work and behave as you'd expect it to, and so you can invest most of your time in just making sure it looks right, making sure the doing the fun stuff, like just getting the colors right, the lighting. So let's give this a pre-render. So it's quite interesting. It kind of flicks into the camera. I feel like it's dissipating too quickly. It'll take a little bit longer to render, but I'm actually going to go back into the particles comp. Since there isn't an option for the particle life, we can simply just unhide the layers by clicking this icon here. We'll go into the air particles and just increase the lifetime from 2 to 3. Maybe extend that render region a little bit. And we'll render this again, and now the dust kind of hangs around in the scene a bit better. And so that's 2 examples of what we can create. Hopefully this gives you an idea of just how much versatility you have. Okay, we'll wrap things up for now. This has been a quick overview of the air element category, and next time we'll have a look at some of the other elements, so stay tuned for that, and thanks for watching.